collective punishment is a war crime, but Britain's Foreign Secretary seems to be fine with that.
In terms of the Israeli response, do you think it is proportionate for Israel to cut off water, electricity, food, fuel, all of those things to the people of Gaza?
Israel has a right to defend itself against attack. The UK completely supports Israel's right to defend itself proportionately. The truth of the matter is that this was a terrorist attack perpetrated by Hamas, who are embedded in Gaza, shielding themselves amongst the Palestinian people in Gaza. And we will continue to support Israel as it seeks to defend itself against this brutal terrorist attack initiated by Hamas.
That is completely shocking, right? It's not ambiguous. If you've got 2 million people in an area which they can't leave, and you say you're going to block food, electricity, right? The very basics that people need to live. If you're going to have a siege, this is it's like a medieval siege, right? Nothing can go in. None of the things necessary for life can go in. That is the definition of collective punishment. And a foreign secretary is asked about that, and his answer is, we give our support to Israel, right? And the answer to that is not difficult. You can say, of course, we understand that Israel think they need to, or you can say Israel have a right to seek out the people who have killed their civilians, right? I know there is an argument that actually, if you're an occupying force, you don't have a right to self-defense, but I wouldn't be shocked, right, to see a politician make that argument. That's sort of in their strategic, or in the matrix of their alliances. That's what you'd expect them to say. But you could say, but the Israeli government should also make sure that it respects international law. This has to be proportionate, and we are against collective punishment. But no, James Cleverly, the UK's foreign secretary, when asked about a siege on 2 million people, they haven't been ambiguous, called them animals, by the way. The Israeli defense minister called them animals and said, we're not going to let food or electricity in. I'm blown away by how inhumane the British political class has come on this issue. And unfortunately, Labour isn't much different. So they've had zero role in providing any pushback to the government on this. This is how Keir Starmer responded to the horrific violence that's broken out in Israel-Palestine.
This is an appalling attack on Israel, a terrorist attack, for which there is no justification. And Israel has every right to defend herself. And the perpetrators of this have deliberately pushed back the prospect of peace agreements, peace talks. And so an appalling act of terrorism. And I think everybody is shocked. I spoke to my counterpart, the leader of the Israeli Labour Party, last night, and heard for myself the anxiety, the concern. As we were on the phone, the siren went off and she had to go down into the shelter, taking her papers with her. So it's an appalling act of terrorism. It needs to be called out across the world.
It's a focus group dancer, right? You've got a really serious issue here. You've got a really, really deadly serious issue here. And he is just saying what he thinks, his swing voters want to hear. Because that was complete nonsense. Anyone who has any expertise in the region would not say that. There are no peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians, right? Israel has the most far-right government in its history. It actively talks about annexing those places. And the way it talks about Palestinians is horrific. It's expanding settlements constantly in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. That's in contravention of international law. They're not interested in peace talks, and Israel hasn't been interested in peace talks for over 2 decades, right? So to say, oh, this will get in the way of peace talks, you're talking complete nonsense. Right? Next, he said, Israel has the right to defend herself, which is weird. Why are we referring to Israel as a woman now anyway? Defend herself. Like, who talks like that? Either way, the statement doesn't make much sense once you recognize Israel is an occupying power, right? And it's outright dangerous in a context where the Israeli government is telling 2 million Palestinians to leave their homes before they level them to the ground, right? They have a right to defend themselves. You're not going to add a qualification there? They have a right to defend themselves so long as they comply with international law. No, just carte blanche. They have a right to defend themselves. How do you think Netanyahu is going to interpret that? Finally, let's address what it means to call this an attack of terrorism. Now, this is the most difficult part of Starmer's answer to criticise, as there clearly was the indiscriminate targeting of civilians by Hamas. However, the former director of Human Rights Watch makes a good point as to why the term is unhelpful. It is not helpful to use the term terrorism in a war when the White House only ever applies it to one side. Better to remind both Hamas and the Israeli government that humanitarian law makes it a war crime to target or indiscriminately fire on civilians. This Red Cross statement does a better job than the White House by applying international humanitarian law to all sides, rather than using a concept like terrorism that the White House applies only to Hamas and leaves the Israeli military unrestrained. So using that word terrorism, saying these are the terrorists, this is the legitimate state, is basically saying this legitimate state can do whatever it wants. The terrorists, of course, terrorists don't have rights. Framing this as two conflicting, armies essentially, who have to follow international law is a much fairer and more productive way of talking about this and saying there's terrorism as a state. Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves was also asked about the conflict. Let's see if she was any more balanced than Starmer.
There are some here. There are certainly people outside this conference, at the conference down the road, so-called World Transform Conference of the Left, who will say, look, we all know the real problem here. The real cause, they say, is the occupation of what they call Palestine.
Well, Gaza is not occupied by Israel. The real cause of what is happening now is a terrorist attack.
Let's just take a moment there to actually talk about what Nick Robinson said in his question. What they call Palestine. The people at the World Transforms protesting about the occupation of what they call Palestine. So we now even the existence of Palestine is now in doubt. Sorry, it's just radical leftists. What do they mean Palestine? Where the hell is Palestine? Right, that's a very worrying statement from a host of Radio 4's flagship show. Let's move on to Rachel Reeves, though. A couple of claims were made there. She said Gaza is not occupied. Now, that's what the Israeli government will tell you and their cheerleaders. There is no formal occupation of Gaza. There is a formal occupation of the West Bank, but not of Gaza. That doesn't, however, mean Gaza is not occupied. Now, this is from NBC News, so not a bastion of radical leftism. Despite pleas from the United Nations and human rights groups, Israel has maintained a land, air, and sea blockade on Gaza since 2007 that has had a devastating effect on Palestinian civilians. The International Committee of the Red Cross considers the blockade illegal and says it violates the Geneva Convention, a charge Israeli officials deny. The UN, various human rights groups, and legal scholars, citing the blockade, consider Gaza to still be under military occupation by Israel. So on the one side, you've got the Israeli government saying, oh no, we left Gaza, we're not occupying Gaza. On the other side, you've got the UN saying, no, you are occupying Gaza, right? You might not have your military officials within its border, but if you control what goes in, if you control what comes out, if everything that happens in Gaza has to happen by your permission, then you are de facto occupying power, right? So Rachel is, it's not occupied. Like, in this sort of smart-ass way. It is. Rachel Reeves also says the real cause of what's happening now is a terrorist attack. Now, I've already referred you to Kenneth Roth's opinion on whether terrorism is a useful word here, but the bigger demand Reeves is making there is to say, do not put this violence in context. Do not look at the background injustice here. Now, I can see why that Manichaean view of the world might be attractive to a politician. It actually reminds me of George W. Bush. It's also incredibly cowardly. For a braver response to the weekend's violence, we can look to the editorial board of Haaretz. Now, that's Israel's main liberal newspaper. So they wrote this. The disaster that befell Israel on the holiday of Simchat Torah is the clear responsibility of one person, Benjamin Netanyahu. The Prime Minister, who has prided himself on his vast political experience and irreplaceable wisdom in security matters, completely failed to identify the dangers he was consciously leading into Israel when establishing a government of annexation and dispossession, when appointing Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir to key positions while embracing a foreign policy that openly ignored the existence and rights of Palestinians. Ash, I want your thoughts on this. I know that British politicians are on some level going to side with Israel, right? Israel is an ally of Britain. But just the cross-party dishonesty when discussing this, I do find quite disgusting.
Well, I think you've got two major factors at play here. One is you've got anti-Palestinian racism, which is pervasive and it's seen as totally okay. It's normalized within British political media. And you've also got the way in which this particular conflict, Israel-Palestine, is being viewed through the lens of the need to put the left back in its box, to attack Jeremy Corbyn and anyone who may be associated with him. I'm going to start first with talking about anti-Palestinian racism. So yesterday I was doing Radio 4, and before my section, which was a paper review, there was an interview with an opposition MP, a member of the Knesset who's part of the National Unity Party. And she was being interviewed live from Israel. And as you would expect, she was very upset about what had happened, the dramatic loss of life. And I think that there was a correct decision on the part of the BBC presenter to be very sensitive to that. But what I thought was utterly unacceptable was that what I thought was absolutely disgusting anti-Palestinian racism went completely uncommented on. So she was saying things like Gaza is independent. Gaza has been left alone to develop. They could have turned it into a little Singapore, but they haven't. And what was being alleged is that Palestinians are so backwards, they're so consumed by anti Semitism that they don't want to develop their own land, they don't want to make a success of themselves. They would rather do harm to themselves if it means doing harm to Israel and to Jewish people. Now, that was a complete pack of lies from start to finish. I mean, you can't have a little Singapore if you're being bombed every couple of years by a much more powerful army. You can't have a little Singapore if you're suffering under the conditions of a blockade imposed by land, sea, and air. You can't have a little Singapore where another state, a hostile state, has control over your borders, who comes in and who comes out. But this is something which goes completely uncommented on. Once more on Radio 4, I heard someone saying and it was unclear to me whether they were talking about residents of the Gaza Strip or Palestinians as a whole, they hate Jews and they hate Israel more than they love their own children. Now, I think that sort of demonization, the sense of a people who are completely crazed by bloodlust and all they want to do is attack Israel, is a profound and deep form of racism. But it's a form of racism that has become normalized. And it is that precise racism which allows the logic of collective punishment, saying these are animal people, these are beasts, and that's why we're going to stop fuel, electricity, and food going into Gaza Strip. That's what undergirds the acceptability of that proposition to British politicians, including the Conservative Party and unfortunately the Labour Party as well. But what you saw, I thought, with that Radio 4 moment, and I think also why Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are happy to talk absolute nonsense and really perpetuate some quite nasty anti-Palestinian rhetoric, is because they see it as part of distancing themselves from the left, right? It's only the left down like that World Transformed who'd acknowledge the existence of Palestine. It's not the UN, it's not, international observers, it's not Human Rights Watch, it's not Amnesty. It's a way of belittling and demeaning all global politics by viewing it through the lens of Jeremy Corbyn. And if it wasn't so serious, what was going on right now, you would laugh and you would call it pathetic, but it's not funny, really. It's poisoning our public conversation because these people can't get over the fact that a socialist was made Labour leader and that it took all of their best combined efforts from the right wing of the Labour Party to most of the mainstream media to take him down. And that's how they're understanding and responding to emerging global events. And it really does us, the public, a disservice.